China has just started construction on its version of a Pentagon building, which will be 10 times bigger with underground nuclear bomb shelters. That's the front page of the Financial Times online. Now, I'm not making any kind of gloomy doomer forecast, and I'm not trying to sell anyone on anything, duct tape, bunkers, shotguns, whatever. But clearly, that's not the kind of headline you used to get on the Financial Times.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today we have Michael Every. Michael is the global strategist with a background in economics and markets for Rabobank, and Michael specializes in analyzing major global developments, focusing on the intersection of geopolitics, economics, and markets with over 25 years of experience, and he joins us today from Thailand. Michael, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Would love to start off asking you what your current thoughts are on the macro environment and geopolitical and financial setting globally.
I think volatile, in one word. I think all of us can agree with that. As we're speaking now, and I presume viewers will be seeing it, in a day or two. We've just recently had US GDP data again. And I've spent a lot of my career playing that game of higher than, lower than for supposedly key numbers like GDP. And I've been very disenchanted with that particular professional slant for a very long time. And I've been making that very clear. And I think the world around us now really does underline that while it's important that, GDP is doing well and that you have a decent figure, what GDP is for matters far more than what GDP is. If we had a massive surge in US GDP for the next 3 or 4 quarters because everyone decided to put down tools and train to be a hairdresser, the entire United States decided we all want to be hairdressers. Nothing against hairdressers. I mean, they're very important people, as everyone is. But if the entire US decided to go in that direction, you could potentially have a fantastic boost in the sale of, scissors and tongs and hairdryers, etc. Would it be setting the US up for the geopolitical world that we live in at the moment? Would it be preparing it for all the challenges that it faces ahead? And I would politely, with full respect to hairdressers, say probably not. So the number itself doesn't matter as much as what is behind the number in terms of not just the sustainability of it. Is it debt driven? Is it productivity driven? What sector is driving it? But what the overall shape of the economy is looking like as it evolves over time. And that 4, as I said, really is a reflection of the times that we live in at the moment, which are much more volatile and much more geopolitical.
Are there particular facets to that you feel have not been given their due, respect, so to speak, Michael?
Oh, yeah, basically nearly all of it. I mean, look, we live in a world where the Financial Times online headline at the time of me speaking to you is that China has just started construction on its version of a Pentagon building, which will be 10 times bigger with underground nuclear bomb shelters. That's the front page of the Financial Times online. Now, I'm not making any kind of gloomy doomer forecast, and I'm not trying to sell anyone on anything, duct tape, bunkers, shotguns, whatever. But clearly, that's not the kind of headline you used to get on the Financial Times website a few years ago. It's not just business as usual. It reflects the fact that how the economy is operating, what everyone around the world who is clued in sees GDP needs to be for, is to get through this period of volatility, both economically, financially, politically, and geopolitically. And how you do that is an open question. You can debate whether one tactic of kumbaya, peace, love, hugs, and free trade would be the best solution. I would posit that it's not. Or whether you grab a machete between your teeth and put on camo and war paint and go jumping into a jungle somewhere, which is not something I would encourage people to be doing either. But in all seriousness, markets and economics and Wall Street and the entire kind of personal investment complex that you see across the US, telling people what to do with their retirement and their 401ks, etc. Everybody, whether you're a corporate or an individual or a government, we all need to be aware of the world that we're now living in. And it's not the same as it was a few years ago. And we all need to prepare accordingly.
And obviously, in this obvious current day and age, we're dealing with quite a bit of inflation. And one of the questions I have for you is, inflation seems to be a persistent challenge. Do you see central banks effectively regaining control, or is this more of a structural issue now?
Well, that's a good question. And again, there we have an intersect between economic policy and economic statecraft, or things to do with geopolitics. Because if you answer that question as a traditional economist, and I spent many years doing that job, you can give a yada yada on one hand, on the other hand, supply, demand, input shocks, labor prices, etc., etc. But then you go to X or your newsfeed, whatever you're looking at, and you see the potential threat of tariffs. For example, you could be seeing the imposition of 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, starting potentially when people are listening to this, but right now, as I'm speaking, in just over 24 hours. Now, if that were to happen, depending on the form they take, of course, that would push everything around. You could see a spike in inflation in the US if that were to happen. If they're structured differently, there won't be. But the point is, you have these potential landmines or these known unknowns right in front of you. And if you understand the framework of thinking for the people who are talking about introducing them and the reason why they're introducing them, those unknowns become less unknown and the knowns become more known. And they do point to the fact that while some parts of the economy could see lower inflation going forward, and I expect they will, in other parts you're likely to see higher inflation. And so it's a much more complicated picture than people want to sell you. When you hear an economist saying, oh, inflation's all coming down, what do you mean by inflation? There are so many different parts of it, all moving within the same stream. Or people saying, well, inflation is going to go up. Well, parts of it may, but not all of it. So you need to be a much more granular thinker than just this broad, simplistic sweep, particularly one that overlooks geopolitics.
And my other question for you, as it relates to global debt levels, of course, skyrocketing. What are some of the long term impacts on the economic growth and financial stability? If you can kind of unpack that, I guess in some ways.
Well, from a traditional economic perspective, debt is bad. That's complete nonsense, of course, because if you didn't ever have any debt, you wouldn't have invested in anything. If you take a loan to go to a good school in the US and you get yourself a fantastic degree, like a good one, not a silly one, and you end up earning 3 or 4 times more than you were previously, that debt paid off for you. So there's good debt, and then there's credit cards just to go out and have a great weekend, in Tijuana with your friends. And that's going to leave you with a hangover and a lot of debt around your neck. That's not so clever, is it, right? So debt in itself doesn't tell you anything. What it's being invested in tells you a lot. And the difference between your nominal growth rate of the economy and your interest rate tells you a lot. If your nominal economy, ergo your tax collection, is growing at, say, 7%, and you're paying 4% interest on your debt, you can just carry that. You can just roll it in the same way that you can take a larger and larger mortgage if you have a fixed interest rate and you know what it is. If your salary is going to keep going up, it's not a problem. But of course, the issue is when interest rates go up, when the debt gets so high that you can't handle it relative to your income, or if you are splurging on endless Tijuana trips rather than something practical. And where we start from now is a Western economy, and in fact a global economy with 1 or 2 exceptions, where we have staggeringly high government debt. We have very high personal debt in most places, largely because of mortgages and credit cards and so on. And we have pretty high corporate debt in a lot of them. And yet, in front of us, we can see higher interest rates than we've had in recent years. And we can see the fact that a vast amount of money still needs to be spent. For example, let's take the US as the case study. You're currently spending around 3.2, 3.3% of GDP on the Pentagon, on defense. Well, you could make a realistic case that needs to double. President Trump himself is talking about that going up to 5. So that's an awful lot more spending. And yet interest payments as a percentage of GDP in the US now exceed spending on defense already. So this is a circle that's very, very hard to square. It doesn't end well unless changes are made. And therefore we are seeing quite radical policy suggestions percolate up. And I suspect some of them will be introduced. And again, the outcome is going to be increased volatility, because in one scenario things work out well and people are surprised to the upside. And that is a whole series of implications for asset prices. And on the other hand, it doesn't work out, at which point things get very volatile in a very different direction. And how you're looking at investing your personal money, or a corporate trying to hedge or plan for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, or even a government or a pension fund thinking about what do things look like, really depend on your interpretation of how these tectonic plates politically, and given I've mentioned the Pentagon again, geopolitically, all come together. So it's not just about your typical wonkish economic or econometric outlook anymore. It cannot be. It's much more than that.
Could you share for, as far, obviously no one has a crystal ball, but could you share, what your prognosis is for, the remainder of this year?
Well, I mean, as I said, volatility. Clearly, you are going to see, under President Trump, a radically different US political economy. Because the US, as has been until now, clearly is not a US that's in fighting shape, and I mean that literally, in a world that is that much more geopolitical and volatile. For example, and look, there's no analysis here, this is just headline plucking, but it certainly fits a pattern that I fully expected to see. You've had President Trump say, how about we cancel income tax? Well, everyone celebrates. Well, how about we replace that with a universal tariff on the rest of the world? Now, if you do the number crunching on that, you can see it doesn't really add up, because the tariff would have to be incredibly high. And eventually, of course, if you had it high enough, besides the inflation and the shock that could cause in the short term, you would eventually put lots of production back in the US, which is a good thing, but to the point that you wouldn't raise any tariffs. So then if you don't raise any tariffs, then where's the tax money coming from? I mean, the growth in the US would provide some of it, but not all of it. So the pure numbers don't add up. But the principle of it, of let's shift the world of the US away from being the world's major consumer of everything, and the one source of demand that everyone in the rest of the world relies on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps removed, to the US produces more at home, and everyone else is forced to produce more for themselves, and just for themselves, rather than for themselves and the US, which will have an enormous domino effect on global supply chains and markets everywhere you look. People cannot conceive of how big a disruption that would be. That's being discussed. So the year is going to be, for me personally, and I think anyone who's plugged in, a minute by minute, hour by hour check of the latest tweet or headlines to see if we are moving along one particular glide path towards one particular set of outcomes in terms of how the US political economy looks, which is, yeah, we tried to change things, but it's all talk, no action, and things stay pretty much the same. Or things get much, much worse because policy actions misfire, and you have like an inflationary or stagflationary bust in the US, which goes global. Or things go the opposite direction, and actually this radical transformation is brought in and does start to work, at which point, well, the US is going to go great guns, and the rest of the world is going to go off of a cliff, more or less. At which point I think you will see great guns being fired, and I mean that metaphorically, and I hope I don't mean it literally. So I hope I'm being, the right combination of flippant and serious here, that you can't make a projection for 2025 because you don't understand, and no one does, where the end point is. All you have to do is look at the history that you said you enjoy, and I certainly do too. Look at economic history, look at political economy, look at national security, look at the interaction of all of them together, and project forward what you think the US is trying to achieve with this new strategy, or this new grand strategy, as we should dub it. What are the signposts suggesting it will or won't succeed, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day? Because you can track some of them fairly quickly in terms of what's a retreat and what's a move forward, what will work and what won't. And then continually update that particular dotted line in your head towards one outcome or another. And let me just underline to viewers, we're not talking about the difference between US GDP being 2.1 or 2.2. That there would be no point in doing this, professionally or personally, if that's what we're discussing. We're talking about the difference between US GDP, hypothetically, not a forecast, being negative in some scenarios, or being 3.5 in another, hypothetically, between inflation being very, very low and being very, very high, or a mix between the two, as I've already said. And whether it's a good mix or a bad mix depends. Whether the US dollar soars or plummets, whether crypto soars or plummets, whether gold soars or plummets, whether various different assets do very well or very badly. We have very, very sharply binary outcomes based on stackable scenarios, which you have to plot going forward. Yes, no, like logic gates going forward. And so I see the world just completely differently to how most financial market analysts do, although there are a subset who see the world the same way that I do.
I
And
know
that's I'm very uncomfortable making a forecast for 2025. I'm just telling you, volatility is what you need to worry about.
I see. Yeah, when I encounter so many people, just kind of just day to day, I feel a lot of people don't have kind of a contrarian view or take on things, and so it's I always look forward to hearing your thoughts and hearing others' thoughts that are differing in point, because there's so many people who are just on the same, they have the same paradigm as relates to things of this matter.
Well, I think that's true in any profession or any trade. You tend to have the people who go with the flow, which, look, it works pretty well most of the time for you. There's a reason to go with the flow. Some people are just outliers and just always want to try and do things differently. And I'm not built that way. I don't deliberately try and accept or reject anything. But I just take things evidence-based, step by step. And when things don't make sense, I put my hand up and say, this doesn't make sense. And, I've often joked that my professional title shouldn't be Global Strategist, Economics and Markets, which is a mouthful and everyone hates. It should be the elephant in the room pointer. Because I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in over the last 25 years where everyone knows something being discussed in the room is complete BS, or the majority of people do, and yet the conversation just goes on and on and on. And everyone's hoping someone will just raise their hand and just say, this is BS. Because if you project forward, for example, you're saying we can never go bankrupt. If X goes past 12, we go bankrupt and we can never go bankrupt. And we've just seen the sequence 2, 4, 8. So you're telling me we're going to go 2, 4, 8, 9, 10. What happens if we go 2, 4, 8, 16? Then we are bankrupt. No, that won't happen. Well, how do you know it won't happen? So these are the kind of conversations that you need to have, looking at simple metrics in some respects, common sense, and a factoring in of lots of interactions of lots of different things. And I get that's very difficult for people to be doing day in, day out. That's why there are specialists trying to do it. But I guess the key point is be skeptical. Common sense a lot of the time can be more important than so-called expert advice if the experts are going with the flow. Don't be afraid to trust your gut on that kind of thing. But just understand the world is complicated, and when people are giving you nice, easy answers, they're not always necessarily true. I wish they were, and sometimes they can be, but not guaranteed that they are.
As it relates to that, and as I progress through the years and such, I become more aware of the nature of our world, whether it's information that's been withheld or ill reasons for getting involved in this affair or that affair, throughout history, as we discussed offline and such. And I wanted to ask you if you could share perhaps some things that kind of broke your view of the world, so to speak. Like it just completely changed how you looked at things. From kind of the status quo. If you care to share any stories, or because I know you have such great insights globally.
Oh, well, okay. I'll try and give you a very, very simple one. I mean, first of all, as I said, I've lived and worked in lots of different places, and the more places you live and work, the more angles of life you see. And that's true if you just go between two different cities in the US, particularly if you don't just go between two different suburbs, which are just as wealthy as each other. Like if you move from New York to LA and you're living in the same kind of bubble in both, you haven't seen anything. Go and live in flyover country for a while. Go and live with people who live very differently from you, and just learn something. And I apply that to everyone, right? And I've done a lot of that in my life, both voluntarily and involuntarily. But I saw great differences in economic outcomes from a young age, being in different countries, friends and relations in different places. And as I grew older, I realized that what we were seeing as a metric of what the world looked like wasn't capturing everything. I mean, I'll give you one specific example. So I was living in Thailand back in 1997 when the Asian crisis hit. Now, I would imagine most people listening in America today don't know what the Asian crisis was, but it was basically Southeast Asia's 2008. It was the GFC, the global financial crisis, which started in 1997 for Southeast Asia. And I was there at the epicenter of it. I saw currencies collapsing, stock markets collapsing. At one point, millionaires were out on the streets just trying to sell their assets to try and get any cash. It was chaos. It was very, very eye-opening, very volatile time to be there. And I looked at everything that was causing it, what was driving it, the hubris that had preceded it, because I was there for the pre-crash hubris too. And I moved back to the West. And all I saw around me in the West was exactly the same idiotic hubris. It was the tech bubble in the late 90s. Petfood.com was the biggest thing in the world at that point, briefly. Everyone was excited about nonsense, and everyone at work was talking about how they could open a then very crappy website, and try and get rich quick. This sounds probably very familiar to a lot of the same memes that are still going around today in different forms. And I was looking at that mess, and I thought, well, okay, maybe we're different from them. And boom, we weren't. We had the tech bubble and that burst, and I thought, okay, that's bad enough. And then, of course, the US decided to refloat it with a housing bubble. Very low interest rates and a housing bubble. And it was screamingly obvious to me, that this is just going to replay everything that happened in 1997, but worse, because you've had one bad bubble, and now you're going to replace it with a worse one, and this one's going to involve property. Once you bring property into it, everyone's involved. And in Asia, it was all about property too, largely. And so I sat there sending missives, very similar to the guys in that movie, The Big Short. I don't know if you've seen it. You may well have. And, I was a young whippersnapper, and no one took me seriously, talking about the fact we're going to have a Great Depression coming up. It's going to be a catastrophe. I didn't have the money to speculate on it myself. I was just describing it. And in the end, I decided to just quit in disgust and just think, I don't want to be here for this. I want to be somewhere else. So I went to do something else, and I watched from a distance as everything did come down in 2008. And suddenly we had Time magazine saying, is this the end of capitalism? Now, of course, we've come back from that, and we've made all the mistakes again in a different way. And I've got a whole stack of reports that I've written for Rabobank over the past 13 years, pointing to the errors we made then and the errors that we made subsequently, and how they've created all the crises that we've ended up with today. But it's only by physically contrasting errors that someone's made over here and then going over there and saying, hey, you're making all the same mistakes, but you're so arrogant because you speak a different language, or you're wealthier, or you don't study the same books they do, that you can't see you're going to make exactly the same error, that you're in a position to actually say, don't do it, please. And they probably won't listen to you, but at least you can ring fence yourself. So, long anecdote, I'm sorry, maybe boring everyone with it, but the key point is, listen to more people from more different backgrounds. Travel more if you can, and travel to places that aren't so glamorous. And read more, and read things that challenge you and upset you and provoke you. Because you're far more likely to learn a truth that may actually help change your viewpoint in politics and economics, in anywhere between the two, by doing that, than just reading the same people over and over again, listening to the same people over and over again, and staying in the same place for as long as you can.
As it relates to reads and such that you mentioned, could you share some of the go-to sources for information that you seek as you gather your information?
Well, okay, I'm going to give you some advice here, and anyone who's listening, feel free to follow it or don't. First of all, it's absolutely essential in today's world to be on a decent social media site. And You can choose yourself which one you prefer. I know what mine is, but I don't want to be seen kind of, advertising them. But not one with pictures of cats who look like Hitler. Preferably, you can have some of that silliness, but you need one where you're going to have good conversations with like-minded people. And not like-minded people. Ones where you can follow people who have strongly divergent opinions, where you might have 3 silly posts and then one which is really thought-provoking that points you in an interesting direction. So you need to do that. And that, in a way, is a repetition of the experience you had growing up in the pre-internet age, which I did, where unless you went to the library or found someone who knew something, it was very hard to get knowledge, per se. And you had to go and explore things for yourself. There wasn't a pathway taking you through it like Google. You had to do the hard work yourself. And to an extent, social media is like that too. There's a lot of nonsense on there, which is a kind of nonsense you hear in people chatting in a bar. But every now and then you find someone who's a barroom philosopher who really has been around the world and done things, and they're just propping up the bar and they can tell you things which will really broaden your mind. Okay, so you need to do that, and you need to be keeping in touch with it constantly because things change. You can, on social media, be lucky enough to watch a real-time discussion between 2 contemporary intellectuals, which will demolish an entire school of thought. I've been there. I've done it. I've seen people having an argument where something that you can still see today, people writing books about and talking about, has been utterly demolished, logically, mathematically, conclusively. And then you're in the know. No, they can keep publishing their silly books, whatever, but you know what's actually true and isn't, as far as you can do, within a scientific methodology. But at the same time, you can't only live on social media. You have to do reading. And I mean serious, real, hard reading. I mean, I've got 2 books in front of me right here now for the camera. So, we've got Thomas Piketty, Capital, for example, which is flawed, by the way. I don't agree with anything in it, or everything in it, but it's worth reading. That's a chunky tome. That's called reading. Or here are Hyman Minsky, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. Okay, that's actually not his best book, but there you go. I'm not picking on them because I pre-prepared them. Actually, I was going to be using them as a support for the camera, to be completely blunt, right? But these are the kind of books I have lying around. You have to have done your deep reading from first principles up to have enough depth to be able to then dip in and out of social media. If you only rely on social media, you don't have the depth and the foundations to understand what they're saying. And if you only do the reading, you don't keep in touch with rapid developments because it takes so long to publish a book. By the time it's published, someone can already have disproven it on social media. So go for the classics and go for the modern classics in terms of a really good discussion thread. But don't think you're going to learn anything if you only look at memes. I love memes. They're hilarious. They're probably the only contemporary art form that I enjoy. But you cannot live on memes alone.
Absolutely. Wanted to pivot and ask you, obviously we're witnessing significant, geopolitical shifts going on. How do you see the balance of power evolving between the US, China, and other emerging players?
Well, that's the $64 trillion question. That's probably the pivotal question. And again, this comes back to Trump and what he's going to try and do to the US economy, which is make it leaner and meaner and in a better position to either set terms to China or to decouple from China. One or the other, to a degree. I don't know exactly how much they'll do it and how quickly, but to a large extent, I think that's probably the policy goal. What China does in response is as important because on one hand, people are focusing on the US. Will Trump do this? Will Trump do that? Yep, we do. I do. We have to focus on that. But not enough people are thinking, if X, then what? If Y, then what? What will China do back? Because they are not going to sit there passively. This is not a video game where you're dealing with an NPC. You're dealing with an opponent that operates in different dimensions, right the way around the world, 24/7, and is looking at ways to push back strategically. And some of them are blatantly obvious, like, as I said, the news breaking today that they're building a Pentagon 10X with bomb shelters underneath. That's pretty obvious, right? What that symbolizes. But there are lots and lots of other ways which have enormously consequential implications for financial markets, which I believe a lot of people listening are focused on to a large degree. I can't unpack all of that now because you can have a 2-3 day discussion on that. But the whole point is, it's happening. Whatever the US does, we need to be aware that there will be a consequence to it, and that can only, again, as I said, increase its volatility.
With the, obviously the rise of China in over the last several decades and such, and obviously throughout history, there being cycles. Of course, there's, as I believe the fourth turning, it talks about, the 80-year cycles, if I recall. Do you see the West as kind of, at the tail end of its, magnificent rise for the last 500 years, basically governing, geopolitical global affairs? Do you see that waning and it going east, more or less in the coming years?
Well, it's a very big picture call, and it depends what we do. Because without suddenly getting into pop culture too much, there is no fate but what we make, Terminator 2. It's up to us. If the West doesn't change, you look around you and you have to say, yeah, it doesn't have the brightest of futures. Because if you look at history, you can see that a bloc or a civilization that no longer appreciates its own cultural traditions, which is true to a large extent in the West, which has a weak economy, which is true in most of the West, which doesn't produce enough engineers, scientists, mathematicians anymore, which is true, which no longer produces many warriors, which is true, which is all about consumption and short-term immediate gratification, and people looking at pictures of cats that look like Hitler, is not one that really in the long run offers very much. And then, of course, you offer up demography to the point where people don't want to have children. And you say, if a society can't even replicate itself, how does a civilization do that? But on the other hand, if you look at other cultures around the world, because a lot of Western critics look at that and vociferously repeat those points, you have to look at what the other side is doing. And the other side certainly produces a lot more mathematicians, engineers, etc., etc. Yep, that's true. Not many original ideas, but lots of engineers. They also have terrible problems with demography to a large extent. So their societies are withering away in the future even faster than ours. They do put more emphasis on producing warriors, it would appear, although, looks can be deceptive. And I would posit that they're probably prouder of a lot of elements of their culture, relatively, but equally they love Western culture. Western culture still is gratefully wolfed down by most other countries that I've lived in. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So it's a mixed picture. And then the West itself can change. It regularly has changed. And I think you look at recent election results, it is changing. Now, some people will like that and cheer it, and some people will despise it and oppose it. And it's not my role to judge. It's my role to look at it and try and predict what that will mean for politics, geopolitics, and by extension, financial markets. But I can certainly see many signs, which I fully expected to see a few years ago, that we are seeing some attempt to try and basically slim down from being an overweight, late 50s guy who's just spent the entire time eating junk food and watching junk TV, to try and get back to as fit as you were in your 30s, which with good diet and a hard workout and sensible living, you can actually do. You're not going to live forever, but you can certainly recapture a lot of your previous health and dynamism if you eat right and live right. And I think that may be what we see, but the implications there are still huge. Because imagine you're a company that produces junk food and suddenly you're going to go over to someone eating protein shakes. It's not going to work out so well. Imagine you're someone who produces XL, triple XL sweatpants, and now you need to be producing gym gear and kettlebells. There's a mix of products that need to be created for that particular society. That will change. And at the same time, who makes them? Are they made abroad or are they made domestically? This is one of the key points. So you can see the flow through. to what I'm talking about. If society changes, politics changes, society changes, economies change, markets change. And you need to be looking at these trends.
Now, if in a we'll go to a fictitious world here, and we'll put you in the role of like Cincinnatus from the Roman era, and you were given absolute power and authority. What 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 would you do to effectuate the changes that you feel need to be made?
Wow. Well, that's a very generous offer. Thank you. I presume I have to sign that in blood in triplicate somewhere to get that. Um, who am I running? I'm running the US, or I'm running the entire world.
You're
Just
you're
to
right. You're
clarify.
running the world. Well, let's start out. Let's just start off with the world. Let's just pose it out there.
Okay.
Yeah, you're.
Okay. Well, clearly we're in La La Land to be discussing it. Okay. So I'm going to give a longer answer and a shorter answer. The longer answer is I would hope everyone could take a step back and look at the fact that while you're always going to have national interests, which will differ, and to a degree it's a zero-sum game, some countries are definitely in a position whereby their gains come as a loss of others to an extent that the other cannot tolerate, and realize that too much winning actually ends up with losing. So say, for example, if you're a country with a massive trade surplus, to bring it back to economics, most countries who have that walk around crowing, going, we're so great, we have a trade surplus. Well, that means someone must have a deficit. And if you're saying it's great to have a surplus, imagine how the guy who's got the deficit feels. Why can't you agree, I'll have a surplus for 5 years and then you have one? Like a seesaw. I know that's a simplistic, unrealistic answer, but if you really think you can build a world system where only you get a surplus and no one else does, only this particular echelon in society gets all the gains from the economy and the other 80% don't, or 90% don't, it's not going to last. If you're that dumb that you think, here's a system which is set up which rewards me and mine and nobody else, and then nothing will ever change it, wonder why I'm not speaking Latin like Cincinnatus. It's because empires fall. Systems crumble and collapse if you push them too far. So that's the longer answer, and I'd want people to wake up to that. The shorter one is one I've mentioned before, and I'm going to repeat it again, because it's an anecdote, and I hope it will speak to people. That you have two broad schools of political economy, okay? And one of them is that if you control everything, if the government controls it all, things will turn out all right, because the government knows what it's doing. Now, in America, people are pretty skeptical about that. Obviously, in Europe, they lean more towards it, and the further you go towards China, the more they believe in that. Obviously, there's a very healthy counter-reaction to that after the evils that arose in the 20th century, where too much government doesn't know what it's doing, and if we've got it as a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You start hitting everyone like that. You can't put a square peg in a round hole, etc., etc. I think we want to try and avoid that. On the other hand, you have the American liberal tradition, which is very addictive, of saying freedom is great. Let's be absolutely free. And that's a wonderful expression of the human spirit, except a great number of things need coordination and cooperation. For example, you couldn't have America defended only by a militia. You do need an army. You're not going to get that by everyone just arming themselves at home, which requires a government, which requires a central bureaucracy, which requires taxation powers, etc., etc., etc. So you can clearly already see there are exceptions. And then you're just arguing in the middle between the two, right, where the line falls. But the point I want to make is this. You'll never find the correct solution for the following reason, and that's this, that the great Austrian economist, like a real free market believer, Schumpeter, who was an absolute genius, the level of IQ of that generation of economic thinkers from the last century, we're in the dust compared to them. They used to write books 500, 600, 800 pages long with classical references and advanced maths and think nothing of it. You couldn't write an 80-page book today and expect anyone to read it. Even an 8-page article, I can assure you, would be a push for even very senior people in international institutions. And I'm not joking when I say that. I heard one say that recently. I only read the bullet points. So I'm not kidding. Anyway, so he spent his entire life arguing that to avoid the evils of government control and totalitarianism, you had to have free markets. And right at the end of his life, he realized that's not going to work. It's not going to work because freedom means nothing without morality. So in the same way that in America years ago, people used to wear those bracelets, what would Jesus do? I don't think they're a thing anymore, but I remember they were a thing. He was arguing you can give everyone complete freedom to do what they want, but you have to have an internal mechanism that tells you that's a really bad way to be doing business. I really shouldn't be doing this because it's just going to be bad for me in the long run, bad for my community, bad for my city, bad for my country, bad for the planet, however you want to factor it in. But it needs to come from your own inner morality. The government can't impose that on you. It won't work. People will find their ways around it, and you'll just have bureaucrats chasing bureaucrats chasing bureaucrats. And if you get rid of all the bureaucrats and you don't have morality, then you just have anarchy and very unpleasant situations. So I've given you a very long-winded answer. I actually thought this was going to be the shorter one, so I'm sorry. Which is this. I would wish that everyone would start asking that question, regardless of their religion and whether they're secular or not, and I respect all choices, which is, what would X do? And we Kant made a similar point from a secular perspective. Is what I'm doing now in this situation something that one should hold up as a benchmark for all mankind to see? If everyone was watching me right now and saw how I do this, would that be what I want everyone throughout history to look at and say, do it like that? And if it is, do it. And if it isn't, don't. So if everyone would just philosophize a little bit more, maybe the micro would change the macro, and the macro would change the geopolitical, and we could all get along a little bit better. My job would be a lot easier. It wouldn't be needed, which would be fine with me in a greater cause. And we wouldn't have that volatility. We would all just be working efficiently as individuals towards something that works well for everyone. So there you go. That would be my dream. But I don't know if that's at all what you expected to hear.
Now, if you could, and I appreciate you sharing that, if you could have an audience with the main leaders, Putin, Xi Jinping, Trump, these big players globally, and obviously with respect to time, of course, what could you share some thoughts that you would like to impart to them, or so on and so forth?
Well, I think they all understand the game. They all understand the stakes. And let's move away from this idealized moral world I was just talking about to the immoral world of realpolitik, which is absolutely what surrounds us at the moment. And what we're going to see there very clearly is all of them understand that something needs to change. The US is changing. It's going to try and change the global system to strengthen its role and to remain what we call primus inter pares, first amongst equals. Russia wants to be a world power. Again, that's its grand strategy. China wants, Asian hegemony, which would effectively make it an equal of the US, and over time, possibly even stronger. These are incompatible goals to a large degree. So either we have permanent loggerheads and friction, or some kind of deal can be worked out. It cannot be the one that used to be the US at the center of everything and everyone else in the background just playing second and third fiddle. It equally can't be one with the China-centric world where everyone plays the fiddle in Chinese. It can't be one where everyone does it in Russian. Someone's going to have to find a way to make it work together, and I hope we can get there the easy way rather than the hard way. And I think most of them are realistic enough players to understand that in the game, but equally, there's going to be a lot of dangerous bluffing coming up, I think, and it's going to be very, very high stakes, this poker game.
Roger that. A couple other questions that I wanted to ask you. One of them pertaining to BRICS. Michael, what's your take on the BRICS coalition and its potential to challenge the Western-led financial system?
BRICS schmicks. I mean, you've just had a tweet from Trump saying anybody who tries to create an alternative currency within that bloc will face 100% US tariffs. That's not the first time he said it. He's just repeated it. Of course, if they do create an alternative system, they won't be selling to the US anyway, so the tariffs are moot because they'll be selling to themselves. But the key point is, if you do the boring balance sheet accounting of who sells what to whom within the BRICS, and I've done that, it's not hard to do. It's incredibly tedious, and I can assure you 99% of analysts haven't done it. What you see is that they mainly sell commodities to each other. But you can't have a block where everyone's going to be basically selling gas producer to gas producer. That doesn't work. And they sell the commodities into China, and China produces physical goods and sells to everybody else. So China in the center is a factory, everybody else gives them stuff. But maybe Russia will give fertilizer to Brazil to grow soybeans to give to China to feed their pigs, to eat, to feed the workers who then make stuff to sell back to the others. But the system, based on Chinese production, ends up selling to Europe and America. So if they want to lose all that excess production, that's what will happen. They will have mass unemployment. And that's just the start of it. Of course, politics or geopolitics would be dragged into it, and sabers would be being rattled. So I don't see it working, but equally, you can't keep a lid on that pot forever and ever. History goes on forever. These countries will grow. Many of them will grow faster than the US. So something needs to change, and ultimately something will break or fragment. And I think the US needs to be absolutely aware that its job is probably trying to make sure that those BRICS don't build a very big war, just a small one.
I see. And now I wanted to segue to a couple other questions that are kind of more based off your own experiences and what has shaped you. And one of them I'd love to ask you is who has had the most impact on your life?
In my entire life, wow, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, friends and family who I'd rather not share, that can't help forming you as a human being. But I genuinely think, and I'm going to say this and then qualify it so people don't think I'm mad, that in terms of a concept of how the world works, the fundamental layers of it, stripping things away, Karl Marx. Now, I'm not a Marxist. I want to make that abundantly clear. I grew up around Marxists because in Europe, lots of people used to be and still are. In America, I know it's rarer, even if it's kind of a fashionable thing on campus, right? But Marx was wrong, to be abundantly clear. Wrong, very wrong. But a lot of his workings were very interesting and wrong in interesting ways, or raised some very specific points. So like my mum, for example, she used to take me walking when I was a kid, and she was a Marxist when she was young. And she would point to me and say, see that factory over there? They make cars. And I'd say, okay, because we used to make cars where I lived. And she'd say, they want to replace all the workers with robots. And I said, wow, that sounds really interesting. She said, how many cars do robots buy? So this is like a 7-year-old or 8-year-old being given these thoughts. And of course, there are solutions to that problem. Even within relatively mainstream economics, you can point to how you get around that problem. But she wasn't wrong. If you replace all the workers with robots or you automate. Now, actually, by the way, for people who really know the stuff, you'll know that Marx didn't think that was possible. So my mum was actually misinterpreting Marx. Marx thought you could only squeeze value out of a human being and labor, that if you automated, actually it didn't work. Because if he'd understood that, he wouldn't have had half the conclusions that he did. But this kind of pseudo-Marxism or mutated Marxism that my mum was feeding to me, that if you get rid of the workers, where's the demand, is not wrong. That's still one of the fundamental problems we're dealing with post the 1980s, where we decided that, let's just send all the jobs offshore or automate everything. And let's just borrow money so that everyone can keep consuming. And you end up with more debt and income inequality and wealth inequality. So if you take things back to basic principles in terms of pointing out why some things don't work, Karl Marx, even if he doesn't have any workable solutions.
I see. And as it relates to, I know you shared a couple of books earlier, but if you could share other works that have helped aid in your take on the world and such, if you could share that with the viewers.
Well, okay. In terms of history, I think you need to be reading people who like doing the big sweep of history rather than a narrow focus. Narrow focus is great to dip into, but you need what's the bigger picture. I like Eric Hobsbawm, who is actually a Marxist again, and many historians are, but it doesn't come across in his work that way. So his stuff, looking back at the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, is fantastic. Really, really good. The classics are amazing. If you go back and read Polybius, the histories and things like that, you will find truths there going back thousands of years which echo down to the present day. So absolutely you want to do that too. In economics, again, you want to be reading the classics and the stuff that the classic economists wrote. There's very little worth reading that anyone has written in economics for decades. Almost nothing. All the great ideas were already thought of in the past in terms of basic first principles. But I do like, and again, you don't have to read the original book. You can read just summaries of the arguments. I held up Minsky. Minsky's very much worth reading. Totally misunderstood. Lots of people throw his name around without bothering to understand what he was saying. And he was very influenced by Marx. 2 or 3, 4 steps removed. The fact that he was talking about that you had instability built into the system and you could have Minsky moments is a Marxist argument. Contemporary economics doesn't believe you can have a Minsky moment. Everything always balances. It's always good. If you just get the government out of the way, it will all be all right. No, it isn't. It's not true. So Minsky's another one worth reading. But there are lots of other disciplines I recommend. Edward Luttwak, the geostrategist, brilliant read. The Logic of Strategy, fantastic book. So there are many things across different disciplines that I strongly recommend people read, and things that provoke you, things that make you see things differently. And finally, I mentioned the classics. As much as you can handle it, because it's really heavy going, philosophy. Philosophy. I mean, I'm going to circle back to where I started. What is GDP for? That's a philosophical question. If you're not asking philosophical questions like that, and you don't know any philosophy at all, what are you doing? Why are you doing anything? What are we here for? And there are lots of different schools of philosophy, obviously. I'm not saying get involved in all of them and don't lose yourself forever, in that rabbit's warren, that maze, right? But have some of it close to your heart as a guide.
I was going to share with you. I keep it on my stand in front of me. I keep it on my nightstand and such. And I keep books around me, as you can see behind my desk, because it's like I feel like it's a reminder. I feel like you can have an ebook, but with the ebook, of course, you're not looking at it all the time. But I feel like when you have the physical copies, you have depicted around, you can reference them. And you mentioned philosophy, so I had to I had to show you what I had. But I think it's fascinating, and how so much of it stands the test of time.
There is nothing new under the sun. For another piece of classical, old school wisdom, there is nothing new under the sun. No matter what we're seeing, no matter what the technological breakthrough, the philosophical and moral questions of it and the implications and how we deal with them have already been thought about. I mean, now we're talking about AI and maybe even AGI. And on one level, we've all seen Terminator, yada, yada, etc. We can all do that element of it. But that's based on far deeper philosophy. The ancient Greeks were talking about what if we had an intelligent machine, etc., etc., etc. So don't bother trying to reinvent the wheel. Go back and look at the original designs for the wheel. It will save you time as well as making you seem smarter, that you can name drop people who had these ideas, with very odd foreign names a long time ago.
Now, how about advice that you would dispense to your younger self?
Maybe don't get that chest tattoo, which you had to get very painfully covered up. That would be high on the list. No, in all seriousness, I would say another piece of classical wisdom, and in the original language is Gamze Ya'avor, this too shall pass. That it all seems desperately painful and urgent when it's in front of you, but the older you get, the more that you see that, been there, done that. Yeah, been there, done that. Yeah, been there, done that. And sometimes it gets you more aggravated because that's your human foibles. Okay, you're going to make the same mistake, right? I mean, but how many generations of mothers and fathers have seen their teenage children discover alcohol for the first time? We're the first generation that's discovered beer, for example, having grown up in a big drinking town, right? So some mistakes just repeat themselves, and provided you avoid the worst mishaps that can occur, which are serious, obviously, take a chill pill and just recognize that this is just part of a cycle that's going to repeat, but just be prepared to clean up some vomit. And I mean that, personally and professionally and even geopolitically. Just accept it's going to happen, and you'll sleep better as a result.
And how about as it relates to your legacy that you'd like to have?
Wow, thank you for the question. You're the first person who's ever asked me that. Well, look, first of all, the internet's forever, so I guess this chat and all the others I've done over the years will be there, you know, being watched by future generations, which is an extremely weird thought. Um, all I would hope is that some of the pieces that I've written, some of which I do think will stand the test of time or have stood the test of time, largely because they're based, as I said, on the far more profound works of others with, a little bit of special sauce on top, or innovation there. All I can hope is that at the margin, besides maybe entertaining people for a little while or pleasing them briefly, it might have been a microscopic piece of of sand on a beach or a beachhead towards trying to achieve something good. That's all it comes down to. I'm not going to be someone who's going to turn around and say, "Hey, well, look, I help people get a 7% return on aggregate for 5 years or something." That does not float my boat. I mean, if I can do it, great, right? That's ostensibly what the job's for. No, it's did I, and I would hope I did, make a tiny, humble, incremental contribution where I could, when I could, with what I had, to try and make the world a slightly better place in the way that I thought fitted best. And I think that's all any of us can do, right?
Wonderfully said. Michael, how can people learn more about you, get in touch, as well as your works, your publications?
Well, if you go to the website Rabobank Knowledge, you'll see our benchmark publication, the Global Daily, and I write that regularly, if not every day. So feel free to check that out for some of my thoughts. You can look for me on LinkedIn, which I believe is where you found me. And equally, I take part in more conversations on X, and you can find me on X at the Michael Every, Michael, the Michael Every, all one word. And I do interact with people. If people want to chat about interesting things rather than cats that look like Hitler, I will be there to continue that discussion.
Well, Michael, thanks so much for taking time out of your day. I know you're busy to be on. I really enjoyed it, and I hope to have you as a guest in the near future.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. You have a great day too.
You as well. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, consider liking, subscribing, and following Discourse with Christian on social media. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thanks.